The trunk hit the porch steps first, not the bottom step, the top one. It came down hard corner first, and the sound it made was the kind that stops birds. A dry crack, then a sliding scrape across wet granite, then nothing as it went airborne for half a second before landing on the brick path below. The latch gave on impact. The lid swung open and stayed there, and everything Beatrice Fenwick owned in the world spilled out across the cold November ground. A wool dress, dark blue, the one she wore to church. Two flannel nightgowns carefully folded that morning, now unfolded by gravity. A pair of leather gloves she had kept since before Orson died. A Bible with a cracked spine and a ribbon marker she had not moved in 3 years. A small tin box that bounced twice and rolled to a stop against the iron fence post at the edge of the path. Beatrice was still on the porch. She had caught the railing with both hands when the push came, and she held it now. The way a person holds something when they are not sure their legs will stay under them. Her knuckles were pale against the black paint. Behind her, the front door of 14 Callow Hill Street swung shut with enough force to rattle the side lights. She heard the deadbolt turn. She heard the chain pulled across. She stood there in her housecoat and cloth slippers, breathing in the cold air. And she looked at that door for a full minute. Not because she was deciding something. Not because she was waiting for it to open again. She looked at it the way you look at a thing once you finally understand what it actually is, not what you believed it to be for 8 years. 2 crumpled dollar bills were in her housecoat pocket, change from a loaf of bread she had bought the week before. That was everything. No pocketbook, no identification papers, no key to any door in Philadelphia or anywhere else on this earth. She was 72 years old. Her name was Beatrice Fenwick. She had raised 3 children and buried a husband and survived the kind of financial ruin that breaks most people in half. She had lived in this house for 8 years, cooked in that kitchen, kept those floors clean, taken those grandchildren to school on 100 cold mornings. And not one person on Callow Hill Street looked twice. A man across the road pulled his coat collar up and walked faster. A woman in the house next door pulled her curtain to one side, looked out for 3 seconds, and let it fall back. A delivery boy with a handcart glanced over, looked at the scattered clothes, looked at Beatrice, and kept walking. Beatrice let go of the railing. She went down the porch steps slowly because her left knee had been troublesome since August, and she went to the trunk. She folded the nightgowns first, then the dress. She picked up the gloves and the tin box and the Bible. She packed everything back in as neatly as the broken latch would allow, and tied the lid down with the belt from her housecoat because there was nothing else. Then she picked up the trunk and started walking. No plan, no destination she could name out loud. Just one foot in front of the other down a street she had walked 1,000 times, carrying a broken trunk held shut with a cotton belt in her slippers in November. To understand why no one helped her, you have to understand what Philadelphia looked like to a 72-year-old widow in the fall of 1883. The law had not yet caught up with the reality of women like Beatrice. Pennsylvania had been slow to adopt the protections that other states were beginning to extend to widows and single women. A woman without a male guardian, without a fixed address, without a husband's name attached to a lease or a bank account existed in a kind of legal fog. She could not sign a contract without a male cosigner. She could not open a bank account in her own name with any real authority. She could not rent a room without a reference from a man of standing. This was not cruelty by design. It was simply the architecture of a world built for someone else. Beatrice had understood this architecture her entire adult life. She had navigated it quietly the way a person learns to walk a familiar road with bad footing, always knowing where to put her weight. But Orson Fenwick had been the foundation under all of it. And when he died in the summer of 1875, the ground had gone out from under her entirely, and the fall had been long. Orson died of typhoid fever on a Thursday in July. He was 58 years old, and he had been managing their finances since the day they married, the way husbands manage finances in 1875, which is to say that Beatrice had not known there were any finances to manage. She signed what Orson put in front of her. She trusted what he told her. She had no reason not to. When the lawyer came with the paperwork after the funeral, Beatrice learned the full shape of what she had trusted. The house on Broad Street was mortgaged twice. There was a note at the bank that Orson had been paying down slowly for 6 years, and a second note he had taken out 18 months before he died that Beatrice had never heard mentioned. The total debt was larger than the value of the house. The bank was polite but clear. The house would be sold. Beatrice walked out of that foreclosure with 2 trunks and a box of photograph albums. That was the sum of 23 years of marriage made tangible. She was 64 years old and she had nowhere to go. Elias said she could come live with them. He said it the way he said most things, with a kind of easy certainty that made it sound like a decision he had already made and was simply informing her of, rather than an offer she might decline. He and Celestine had the spare room. His mother needed a place. It was simple. For a while it was. Beatrice cooked, she cleaned, she picked up the grandchildren from school when they were small and helped them with their lessons in the evenings. She stayed out of Celestine's way in the kitchen unless asked. She kept her door closed and her belongings confined to the room she was given, and she made herself as small as a person can make themselves without disappearing entirely. She understood the arithmetic. You live in someone else's house, you earn your place there. You do not take up more space than you are given. You do not have opinions about how the household is run unless those opinions are requested. You are useful and you are quiet and you are grateful. And if you are all three of those things reliably enough, the arrangement continues. Beatrice had spent a lifetime learning how to do exactly that. But there was a thing happening in that house that Beatrice did not know about for a long time. And when she finally understood it, she understood why the arrangement had gone the way it had. Celestine Fenwick had found out about the money in the fall of 1881. It had not been deliberate. She had opened what she thought was a household bill from the gas company and found instead a letter from First National Bank of Philadelphia addressed to Elias. The letter was a payment notice for a second mortgage on the print shop taken out in Elias's name alone for a sum large enough that Celestine had to read it twice before the number settled. She put the letter back in its envelope and set it on Elias's desk and did not say a word. But Celestine was not the kind of woman who stopped there. She was thorough by nature, the way people who have grown up without security tend to be thorough, always checking the locks, always counting what was left. She came from a merchant family that had been solvent once and then was not, and the experience had left her with a fine-tuned sense for the sound a financial situation makes before it falls apart. Over the following weeks, she found the rest of it. In the locked drawer of Elias's desk, tucked under a stack of receipts from suppliers, she found a sequence of smaller papers, handwritten, dated across 2 years. Receipts from an establishment in Camden, New Jersey, that no respectable merchant had reason to visit. The amounts were not catastrophic on their own. Added together, they were. Elias had a gambling problem. He had been managing it quietly for years. He was not ruined yet, but he was close, and he was getting closer, and he did not know that Celestine knew. Celestine could not confront him. She had understood the geometry of her situation clearly. A wife in 1881 who challenged her husband on financial matters and lost had nowhere to go. She had her children, her household, and her position, and all of those depended on Elias remaining functional. Divorce meant the end of everything she had built. There was no version of confrontation that ended well for her. So she did the only thing that was within her reach. She looked at the household budget with the precision of someone whose survival depended on it, and she identified every expense that could be reduced. And Beatrice, who ate 3 meals a day and required heating and occupied a room that could theoretically be rented or used for other purposes, was the largest reducible expense. Celestine was not cruel by nature. Beatrice had thought about this a great deal over the years that followed, and she believed it to be true. Celestine was frightened, and frightened people do things that look like cruelty from the outside but feel like survival from the inside. That distinction mattered. It did not change what happened, but it mattered. The comments had started small. A remark about the water bill accompanied by a glance in Beatrice's direction. A sigh over the grocery costs while putting things away. A phrase said into the middle distance rather than directly, "It is remarkable how much more a household costs with 3 adults instead of 2. Beatrice heard every word. She never responded. She had been quiet her whole life. It was not weakness. It was the lesson Cordelia had taught her standing in the small kitchen of the stone cottage in Grayfield on a winter morning when Beatrice was 9 years old. Cordelia had said, "The world does not forgive women like us when we speak. So we stay quiet. We make ourselves useful. We disappear into the edges of rooms until the day comes when we do not have to anymore." Beatrice had waited 72 years for that day. The conversation she had with Elias 3 weeks before the morning on the porch was the closest he ever came to telling her the truth. They were sitting in the front parlor after dinner. Celestine had gone up early. The children were grown and had their own lives, now their own houses, their own evenings. Elias had a newspaper in his hands, but he was not reading it. Finally, he said, without looking up, "Mother, things are going to change a little around here." Beatrice looked at him. She knew what that sentence meant. She had heard variations of it from Orson before every bad stretch. It was a sentence that men used when they wanted to say something difficult without actually saying it. "How long?" she asked. Elias looked at the newspaper. "You will be fine. We will make sure you are looked after." "We will make sure you are looked after," was the sentence of a man who had already decided and was telling her after the fact rather than asking before it. "Elias," she said quietly, "look at me." He looked up, held her gaze for perhaps 2 seconds, then looked at the fire. Beatrice stood up and went to her room. That was the last real conversation they had before the morning with the trunk. The morning itself was a Tuesday in November. Beatrice was at the kitchen table eating toast when Celestine came in. Celestine had a folder with her, the kind of folder a person brings when they want to show they have done research, that this is not an impulsive decision, but a considered one. Inside the folder were pamphlets about the Ladies' Charitable Home on Broad Street, a clean building operated by a church consortium, a place where women of advancing age could live in dignity and community. Beatrice looked at the pamphlets. She looked at Elias, who was standing at the far end of the kitchen near the stove with his hands in his pockets and his eyes on the floorboards. Then she noticed something Celestine had not intended her to notice. Under the folder, slightly concealed but not entirely, was the corner of an open envelope. The return address was a law firm, Philadelphia. She did not have time to read the name, but she understood what it meant. This was not a conversation Celestine was having on her own initiative this morning. This was a plan that had been in preparation for some time, reviewed by a lawyer, structured carefully, and brought to conclusion today. The folder of pamphlets was not research. It was the final document in a transaction that had already been agreed. Beatrice said, "I understand." She stood up and went to her room and began packing. Celestine did not wait until the end of the month. She appeared at Beatrice's bedroom door before noon, not quite knocking her hand on the frame, her face composed into something that was trying to be both firm and reasonable. She said there was an opening at the home today. Her friend had called this morning. A room had become available immediately, and these things did not stay open long. Beatrice was folding the blue wool dress. She did not stop. She said, "Does Elias know you consulted a lawyer?" Celestine was quiet for 1 second too long. "He signed the papers," Celestine said. Beatrice looked past Celestine into the hallway. Elias was there, standing at the top of the stairs, his hand on the banister, close enough to have heard everything. He was looking at his own feet with an intensity that had nothing to do with the floorboards. Beatrice picked up her trunk and walked toward the door. Elias did not step aside immediately. He stood in the hallway, and for a moment Beatrice thought he was going to say something. She stopped. She looked at him directly the way she had looked at him in the parlor 3 weeks earlier, giving him the space to say whatever thing might be worth saying. He opened his mouth. He looked away. Beatrice walked around him and down the stairs. What happened next happened quickly. Celestine came down behind her. There was a brief and terrible sequence of events at the front door, a moment when Beatrice was not moving fast enough, and Celestine's patience ran out, and hands reached for the trunk, and then the trunk was outside, and then Beatrice was outside, and then the door was shut and locked and chained. Beatrice stood on this porch with the scattered clothes around her and $2 in her pocket, and she did not cry. She was 72 years old, and she had been through enough that crying was not in the toolkit anymore. She folded everything back into the trunk. She tied the lid with her belt. She went down the steps carefully because of her knee, and she started walking. 11 blocks to Broad Street Station. By block 6, the left sole of her slipper had begun to peel away from the upper. She kept walking. The station was large and loud and smelled of coal smoke and wet wool. Beatrice stood in the ticket line and read the board. She had $2. A one-way ticket to the closest station to Grayfield, New York, cost $1.85. She counted the coins twice. She bought the ticket. She had 15 cents remaining. She used 10 cents on a bread roll from a cart near the entrance. She sat on a bench in the waiting area with the roll in one hand and the ticket in the other, and she thought about where she was going. Grayfield was a place she had not been in 34 years. She had left it at 18, boarded a southbound train with a small bag and the address of a cousin in Philadelphia, and she had never gone back. Not for holidays. Not for her mother's funeral in 1849. Cordelia Taft had died of pneumonia in February of that year, alone in the stone cottage on the east edge of town, and no one had found her for 3 days, and by the time Beatrice received the letter, the burial had already been done. Cordelia had left a will. The will was specific about one thing: the cottage was to be sealed. Not sold, not rented, not opened, just sealed and left. Beatrice had always thought this was strange, but she had 3 children under the age of 10 and a husband who needed supper at 6 and a life that did not pause for strangeness. She had told herself she would deal with it someday. Someday had never come. She looked at the ticket in her hand. Grayfield. She had 15 cents and a broken trunk and nowhere else on this earth to go. The train left at 4. It would arrive at the rural stop outside Grayfield sometime after 10 in the evening. She would be in a town she had not seen since she was a teenager in the dark of November in slippers. And yet, there was something underneath the fear that was harder to name. A kind of pull she had been suppressing for 34 years, or without fully knowing she was suppressing it. Cordelia had sealed that cottage for a reason. Cordelia had been specific and deliberate about everything she did always. She did not do things by accident. Beatrice had never let herself think too hard about what that reason might be. Now sitting in the noise and smoke of Broad Street Station, with everything she owned tied shut with a cotton belt, she let herself think about it. The train was called. She picked up her trunk and got in line. She found a seat in the last car, the cheapest section, wooden benches, in a window that did not quite close all the way. She wedged the trunk between her knees and folded her hands in her lap and watched Philadelphia flatten and then fold up into hills as the light went. The woman beside her fell asleep within 20 minutes. A man across the aisle ate a sandwich and looked out the window. Nobody spoke to Beatrice. Nobody looked at her twice. She had spent a lifetime being the kind of person nobody looked at twice. Cordelia had told her that too. Standing in the kitchen of the cottage in Grayfield on that winter morning, and at 9 years old, Beatrice had not understood it as a lesson about survival. She had understood it as a statement about what they were. Women like us, Cordelia had said, as if that were a category with defined edges, a set of rules that applied specifically to them and not to others. It had taken Beatrice most of her life to understand that Cordelia was not describing a permanent condition. She was describing a strategy, and strategies have endpoints. The train moved through the dark. The hills of upstate New York rose up on either side, and between them the valleys were full of shadow and the occasional light of a farmhouse window, orange and small and very far away. Beatrice could smell pine through the gap in the window. Cold, sharp, the smell of a place that did not know or care what had happened to her today. She sat with her hands folded and her trunk between her knees and her 5 cents in her pocket, and for the first time since the door had closed behind her on Callow Hill Street, she felt something shift. Not hope, not yet. Something more structural than hope. The sense that the ground beneath her feet, however uncertain, was at least ground she had stood on before. She was going home. She did not know what home meant anymore, or whether the cottage was still standing, or what she would find when she got there. She did not know about the sealed cellar or the documents waiting inside it, or the name written on a particular envelope that had been sitting on a particular mantelpiece for 34 years. She did not know any of that yet. She only knew that Cordelia had told her to go there, not in words Beatrice had heard spoken, but in the simple fact of a sealed door and a will that said, do not open it, do not sell it, do not give it to anyone, and a daughter who had spent 34 years not listening and who was now finally on the right train, going in the right direction. The woman beside her stirred in her sleep. The man across the aisle finished his sandwich and folded the paper neatly and put it in his coat pocket. The train moved through the dark upstate hills with the particular rhythm of a journey that has already committed itself, that has passed the point where turning around would make sense. Beatrice closed her eyes. She did not sleep, but she let herself be still in a way she had not been still all day, perhaps all year. And in that stillness, the shape of the next 24 hours began to take form in the way that shapes take form when you stop trying to force them and simply let the darkness organize itself. There was a cottage in Grayfield. There was a sealed door. There was a reason Cordelia had said not to open it, which meant there was something inside worth keeping sealed. Beatrice Fenwick was 72 years old, and she had $2 in a broken trunk and 5 cents in a ticket to the end of the line. That was not nothing. It was not nothing at all. The train stopped at a wooden platform with no name on it. Just a lantern on a post, a rectangle of light in the middle of nothing, and a man in a station master's coat who looked up from his logbook when Beatrice stepped down, took one look at her slippers and her rope-tied trunk and went back to his logbook without a word. She asked him how far to Grayfield. 4 miles east, he said. Road is passable if you stay on the gravel. She asked about transport. He said the last wagon had gone 2 hours ago. She asked if there was anyone in town who hired out horses at this hour. He said he would not know about that. She picked up her trunk and started walking. The gravel was harder on the slippers than the brick sidewalks of Philadelphia had been. By the end of the first mile, she could feel every stone through the thin soles, each one a small, specific fact about the ground beneath her feet. The sky was clear and the moon was up, and the hills on either side of the road were black against a dark blue sky, and the pines were very tall, and the air was cold enough that her breath came out in small clouds that dissolved almost immediately. She had not been in this part of the world since she was 18 years old. Nothing looked familiar except the shape of the land itself, the way the hills curved, the way the valley opened, and then narrowed again, the particular angle of certain ridgelines against the sky. The body remembers geography the way it remembers certain sounds, not the specific details, but the feeling of them. She walked. She was a mile from where the station master had told her the town center would be when she heard wheels on the gravel behind her own, a wagon moving slowly coming from the direction of the station. The horse was an older animal taking its time. The woman driving it pulled up alongside Beatrice without being asked and looked down at her with the particular expression of someone who has already made a decision. Harriet Ashby was 88 years old. She was small and wiry in the way of very old women who have not allowed age to make them soft, with a face that had compressed over the decades into something fine-boned and sharp-eyed, and hands on the reins that were twisted with arthritis but steady. She was returning from collecting a package at the station, something she did herself each week because she did not trust anyone else to bring her mail undamaged. She had seen Beatrice on the platform. She had continued to the wagon, loaded her package, and then turned around. "Get on," she said, not a question. Beatrice looked up at her. "I have a stove going," Harriet said, "and whatever you are walking toward will still be there after you have eaten something." Beatrice put her trunk in the back of the wagon and climbed up. They did not speak for the first 10 minutes. The horse moved at its own pace, and the wagon creaked in the cold air, and the road curved through a stand of old pines that closed overhead like a corridor. Then Harriet said without turning her head, "What brings you to Grayfield this time of night in November?" Beatrice said the Taft property. "My mother was Cordelia Taft." Harriet pulled the horse to a stop, not a gradual slowing, a full stop right there on the road, the horse surprised enough to toss its head once. Harriet turned and looked at Beatrice directly for the first time, and there was something in the way she did it that was not shock exactly. It was more like the look of a person who has been waiting a long time for a particular thing to happen and is still, despite all that waiting, not entirely prepared for it. "Cordelia did not have children," Harriet said. "That is what everyone here knows." Beatrice said everyone here knows wrong. Harriet looked at her for a long moment. She had gray eyes, the kind that catch light in the dark. She looked at Beatrice's eyes specifically, and Beatrice did not know what she was looking for, but whatever it was, she seemed to find it, because she clicked her tongue at the horse and the wagon started moving again. She said, "You need to see Reverend Pendleton before you see anyone else. First thing tomorrow morning." Then she said nothing else until the wagon reached her house. The soup was bean and salt pork thick, served in a bowl that had been used so many times the glaze was worn off the rim. The bread was cornbread, a day old but still good. Beatrice ate without speaking, and Harriet sat across the table and watched her with the direct attention of someone taking inventory. When the bowl was empty, Harriet went to the kitchen, came back with a tin box, and set it on the table between them. She took a key from around her neck. It was a small iron key on a cord, and from the look of the cord, it had been worn there for a very long time. She unlocked the tin box and opened it and took out a single folded paper. She did not hand it to Beatrice. She set it on the table and unfolded it herself and turned it so Beatrice could read it. The writing was familiar before Beatrice understood why it was familiar. The slant of the letters, the way the T's were crossed, the particular shape of the capital C. She had not seen this handwriting since she was a child, but the body knows certain things independent of the mind's record-keeping. It was a letter from Cordelia Taft, dated June of 1848, 1 year before Cordelia died. "Harriet, dear," the letter said, "if a woman ever comes to Grayfield and tells you she is my daughter, believe her. Do not ask for proof first. Give her a meal first. Then take her to the Reverend. He has what she will need. She will have eyes like mine." The letter was signed simply Cordelia, in the same hand Beatrice had known. Beatrice read it twice. Then she looked up at Harriet. Harriet said, "She wrote that 35 years ago. I have worn that key every day since." There was a silence in the room that had a specific quality to it. Not the silence of two strangers in an awkward moment, but the silence of something very old, finally arriving at its destination. Beatrice said, "Did you know her well?" Harriet picked up the letter carefully and folded it back along the original creases. She said, "Well enough." Then more quietly, better than most people knew. "And I was there the night you were born." Cordelia did not want a doctor. She wanted someone she trusted. "I was 26 years old and I had already helped birth 4 babies on neighboring farms." She looked at Beatrice steadily. "I remember everything about that night, including your name being spoken for the first time." The weight of that sentence took a moment to settle. Beatrice set her hands flat on the table. "Harriet said Cordelia turned you toward the window so you could see where you had arrived. She said your name is Beatrice, and this world owes you more than it knows." I have never forgotten those words because I had never heard a mother say exactly that to a newborn before. Harriet put the letter back in the tin box and locked it and put the key back around her neck. She said, "The Reverend is at the church by 7. I will take you there in the morning." Reverend Sylvester Pendleton was 65 years old and had been the pastor of Grayfield Baptist Church for 30 years. He was a tall man, spare with white hair and the kind of careful stillness that comes from decades of sitting with people in difficult moments. He was also constitutionally suspicious, not of any specific person or idea, but in the general sense of a man who had learned that things presenting themselves as simple were frequently not. He looked at Beatrice across the desk in his small office behind the sanctuary, and he asked, without preliminary, "Do you have documentation?" Beatrice said no. He said, "You have no papers establishing your identity, no record of birth, nothing in writing." She said, "Nothing I carry with me." He said, "Then I cannot help you with what Harriet is suggesting." Harriet, who was sitting in the chair beside Beatrice, reached into her coat pocket and put the letter from Cordelia on the desk. Pendleton picked it up and read it. He read it again. He set it down and looked at it for a moment before he spoke. He said Cordelia could have been deceived about who might come. Harriet said Cordelia was not deceived by anyone in her life, and she wrote that letter knowing she would be 35 years dead when it was opened. She was not writing in haste. "Furthermore, I delivered this woman into the world. I know who she is." Pendleton looked at Beatrice. He said, "How did you know to come here?" Beatrice said, "I had nowhere else to go." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is either the truest answer or the most calculated one." Beatrice said, "If I were calculating, I would have prepared something better than cloth slippers in a broken trunk." Pendleton looked at her feet. He had not appeared to notice the slippers until that moment, but now that he looked for long enough that something in his expression adjusted. He stood up. He went to the locked cabinet behind his desk and took out a ring of keys. He selected one, an old one with a long barrel, and he set it on the desk next to the letter. He said, "Cordelia Taft came to me in the autumn of 1848. She gave me a sealed envelope and asked me to keep it. She told me to give it only to her daughter when her daughter came. I asked her how I would know. She told me her daughter would come when she had no other door." Those were her exact words. He pushed the envelope across the desk. It was yellowed with age, sealed with red wax, and on the front in Cordelia's handwriting, "For my daughter Beatrice." Only her. Pendleton said, "I have kept this for 35 years. I did not open it. I will not open it now." Beatrice picked it up. Her name in her mother's hand. She had not seen her own name written in that handwriting since she was 17 years old, and it did the thing that such things do arrive somewhere deeper than reason. She did not open it at the desk. She put it in her coat pocket and stood up. Pendleton picked up his own coat from the hook behind the door. He said, "I will take you to the property. I have the key." They walked together the 4 miles to the Taft Cottage, Pendleton carrying a lantern. Harriet had offered the wagon, but Pendleton said he would walk. He was a man who processed things through walking, and Beatrice understood this without being told. On the road, he said, not looking at her, "I should tell you something about the land before you see it." She said, "Tell me." He said the Hargrove family has been trying to acquire the parcels surrounding the Taft property for the past several years. Alistair Hargrove, the oldest son of Colonel Horatio Hargrove, who died in 71, has filed a petition with the county court to have the property declared abandoned estate. The hearing is scheduled for the 15th of January. Beatrice counted backward in her head. It was now the first week of November. She had less than 10 weeks. She said, "Do they know I exist?" He said, "Until tonight, I would have said no. After tonight in a town of 200 people, I cannot say the same." Beatrice walked beside him and did not speak for a while. Then she said, "Someone came to the property before I arrived. The station agent said the land is known to be sealed." Pendleton said, "There was a man from the Hargrove operation seen on the East Road in August, a hand named Nathaniel Stanwyck who keeps horses for the Hargroves and has loose habits when it comes to conversation." Nobody paid it much attention at the time. The road curved past a grain elevator and then a field that had gone back to weeds and then opened into a stretch of meadow along a creek. Beatrice could hear the water before she could see it, cold, fast, moving over stones somewhere in the dark below the bank. And then she saw it. Past the overgrown field behind a collapsed iron gate set back from the road, at the end of an avenue of maples that had not been trimmed in 3 decades. A stone cottage, small, maybe 4 rooms with a wooden frame second story, in a tin roof gone brown with rust. The windows were shuttered from the inside. The front door had boards nailed across it in an X pattern, sealed, just as the will had said. Beatrice put her hand on the gate. The iron was cold and rough with rust, and one side had come off its hinge and lay in the weeds at an angle. She pushed through. Weeds came to her waist. Pendleton raised the lantern when they reached the front door, and they both saw it at the same moment. The boards nailed across the door were old grade with decades of weather, but around the original lock plate the wood was different. Fresher gouges, lighter in color, not yet weathered to match the rest. Someone had worked at the lock. Not successfully, but they had tried. And afterward, they had added 3 new nails, large ones to prevent the door from being opened, and these nails were barely rusted at all. Pendleton crouched and looked at the nail heads. He said, "This was done within the last 6 months. These are cut nails, not the wrought iron ones from the original boarding." Beatrice said the Hargrove man in August. Pendleton said most likely. He handed her the lantern and took a short pry bar from his coat pocket. He had brought it without mentioning it, which meant he had thought this moment might come. He worked at the newer nails first, then the older boards, and Beatrice held the lantern steady while he worked. The third board caught, the pry bar slipped, and the edge of it caught Beatrice's left palm on the way past. She made no sound. She shifted the lantern to her right hand and kept it steady. When Pendleton noticed the blood on her palm, he stopped what he was doing and without a word tore a strip from the inside of his coat lining and wrapped her hand with the focused efficiency of a man who had dealt with worse. He did not make a production of it. She looked at him while he tied the bandage. He said, "Without looking up, Cordelia came to my services for 30 years. Always the back pew, always alone. She put money in the plate even in the years I knew she had almost nothing. The year before she died, she came to me after a service, and she pressed that envelope into my hands, and she said, 'Reverend, I am sending something ahead for my daughter. Please be the man who keeps it safe.' I asked her what kind of man she thought I was. She said the kind who shows up." He finished tying the bandage and went back to the boards. The last board came free. The door behind it was unlocked. The knob turned on the first try. Beatrice raised the lantern and stepped inside. She had expected the smell of a sealed house, the particular combination of mold and animal and rot that 34 years of abandonment produces. She had been preparing herself for something uninhabitable, something she would have to spend days clearing before it became livable. She had been preparing for the worst available option to still be very bad. What she found was something else entirely. The air inside was cool and dry with no mildew, no animal smell, no rot. It was not the freshness of an open window, but the stillness of a room that had been carefully closed against the outside world, the way a sealed jar maintains its contents. The furniture was covered in white sheets. Beatrice pulled the nearest one off and found a wooden chair, clean, no visible dust, no swelling in the joints from moisture. She pulled the sheet from the kitchen table and ran her hand across the surface. Polished maple. Someone had waxed it before covering it. She could feel the wax. She opened a cabinet, dishes stacked with cloth between them to prevent chips. She opened a drawer and found her mother's kitchen scissors in the same position she remembered from childhood, blades down, handles up in the right-hand drawer beside the sink. She stood there holding those scissors and did not move for a moment. Pendleton came in behind her and stopped in the doorway. He said, "I have seen abandoned houses. This is not one." Beatrice put the scissors back exactly where they had been. She went to the fireplace in the main room. Above the mantel was a framed photograph, a daguerreotype in a wooden frame, and behind it, half hidden, something white. Beatrice reached past the frame and pulled out an envelope. Yellowed, sealed with red wax. Her name on the front in Cordelia's handwriting. Not the same envelope Pendleton had given her. A different one. Another one. Pendleton saw it from across the room and said nothing. Beatrice broke the wax and opened it. The letter inside was 2 pages written in Cordelia's clear, deliberate hand, each line straight, despite the absence of ruled lines on the page, the hand of a woman who had taught herself to write carefully and had practiced until it required no effort. It began, "I knew you would come. Not because I knew you well enough to predict you, but because I built this for someone with no other door, and you are mine." Beatrice read the next paragraph standing up. Then she sat down in her mother's chair beside the unlit fireplace because her legs had decided that standing was optional. The letter said, "Go to the cellar. The lock combination is your birthday. Month, day, year. Open the door. Everything you need is below. I put it there for you because I could not trust anyone else to keep it, and I could not trust time not to scatter it. The world will try to tell you that what is in that cellar does not belong to you. It is wrong. Every paper down there has been filed correctly, notarized properly, and paid for with money that was given to me freely by a man who owed you a great deal more than money." Beatrice read those words 3 times. She looked up. Pendleton was standing by the door with his hat in his hands. She found the cellar hatch in the pantry, under the braided rug she remembered from childhood, the one Cordelia had made herself, from strips of old wool clothing, the colors of which Beatrice could still name: the dark green from a work coat, the rust red from a dress Cordelia had worn until it could not be mended again, the gray-brown of a blanket they had used in winter. The padlock was old brass solid, heavier than it looked. Beatrice turned the dial. October 14th, 1811, the year she was born, in this house, in this county. The lock opened on the first try. She descended wooden stairs into a room that smelled of earth and cedar, and something else she could not immediately name, a dry, dusty smell that resolved after a moment into the smell of old paper. A lot of old paper. Pendleton came to the top of the stairs with the lantern and held it down for her. The cellar was organized with the precision of a person who understood that organization was the difference between a message received and a message lost. Shelves along every wall, not food storage, not tools, documents. Boxes of them, manila and leather, each one labeled in Cordelia's block letters. Land, trust, legal, personal. Beatrice lifted the box marked land and carried it up to the kitchen table. Inside, land deeds. Not just the quarter-acre the cottage sat on, 42 acres of surrounding land fields to the North Forest, to the West Creek frontage along the entire eastern boundary. All in the name of Cordelia Taft. All recorded and notarized at the county clerk's office. All with tax receipts stapled inside the back cover, paid every year, the most recent payment dated March of 1883, 8 months ago, from a trust account at a bank in Albany. Someone had been paying those taxes every single year 34 years after Cordelia died. Beatrice opened the trust box, bank statements going back to 1812. An account opened with an initial deposit of $500. Monthly contributions after that small, at first growing larger as the decades passed. The most recent statement, printed 6 months ago and mailed to a law firm in Albany called Stratton and Sons, showed a balance of $412,000. Interest had compounded. Dividends had reinvested. The money had grown in the dark, the way certain things grow quietly without being watched, becoming something larger than anyone thought to plan for. Beatrice sat with that statement in her hands for a long time. 24 hours ago, she had been standing on a porch in Philadelphia with 2 crumpled dollar bills. She looked up and found Pendleton watching her from across the kitchen. He had not asked to look at any of the documents. He was simply present in the way he had been present all evening, without requiring anything from the situation. She said, "There is a law firm, Stratton and Sons in Albany." He said, "I know the name. The senior Mr. Stratton passed some years ago. His son Prescott runs it now. They have sent letters to the county seat regarding this property." She said, "On whose behalf?" He said, "On behalf of the estate of Cordelia Taft." Beatrice set down the trust statement and reached for the smaller box wrapped in cloth at the back of the shelf. No label. She unwrapped it. Inside was a single document in a protective oilskin sleeve. She slid it out and unfolded it. It was a birth certificate, hers, not the one she had grown up with, the one filed in Philadelphia that listed Leander Ellison in the space marked father. This was a different document issued by a different county, notarized by a different hand. In the space marked father, the name written was Colonel Horatio Hargrove. Beatrice's hands went still. She knew that name. Everyone who had grown up in this part of New York knew the Hargrove name. 3 generations of the largest dairy operation in the county, the family that had funded the town library, the family that had paid for the fire brigade. Colonel Horatio Hargrove had been the patriarch, a man of standing and influence, in Sunday church attendance, the kind of man whose handshake carried the weight of a signed document. He had died in 1871. His oldest son was Alistair Hargrove, who had filed a petition to take this land and whose hearing was scheduled for January 15th. Beatrice set the birth certificate on the table beside the trust statement. She went back to Cordelia's letter, page 2. Horatio and I were together for 2 years before you were born. He was already married. He had a family and a name to protect in a county that expected certain things from him. When I told him I was expecting, he offered to pay me to go away. I said no. He offered to take you and raise you as his own under his wife's name, as if you were hers. I said no to that as well. I was not going to let my daughter grow up as someone's secret inside a house where she was a lie. He did not argue. He was not at his core a man who argued. He was a man who understood obligation even when the obligation was inconvenient for him. He set up the trust. He had his lawyer, a man named Stratton, draw up the deed for the surrounding land and put it in my name. He said it was for you for when the time came. He said he was sorry he could not do more without undoing everything else. I sealed the cottage because I did not trust his family. Not Horatio specifically, but the family, the name, the habit that powerful families have of protecting their own interests without meaning to be cruel about it. If they found out about you after I was gone, they would have come for the land. They would have challenged the trust. They would have found a way to make it complicated enough that the truth got buried under the complication. So I buried it first, in a place only you could find, in a lock only you could open. Come home, Beatrice. Everything is waiting for you. Beatrice read that last paragraph without moving. She read it again. 72 years old, and she had spent every one of those years believing herself to be the daughter of Leander Ellison, a factory worker who drank in excess and raised his voice in proportion to how much he had drunk and walked out of their lives when Beatrice was 7 years old, without a forwarding address or a goodbye. That story had organized everything. Her patience with bad situations, her silence in rooms where she had things worth saying, her lifelong practice of making herself small enough to fit inside whatever space she was given. Leander Ellison had been a ghost in the machinery of every decision she had ever made, and he was not her father. He had never been her father. Beatrice pressed both hands flat on the table and looked at the 2 documents in front of her, the birth certificate and the trust statement and the letter in her mother's handwriting, and she felt something move through her that was too large and too complex to name precisely. Not joy, not grief, though there was grief in it. Something more like the moment when a structure you have been living inside reveals itself to be not the building you thought it was. She heard Pendleton's footstep in the doorway. She did not look up immediately. She needed another moment. He gave it to her. When she did look up, he was holding the lantern at his side, watching her with the attentive quiet of a man who has sat with people in the immediate aftermath of large things enough times to know what it requires of him, which is almost nothing and almost everything. She said, "Pendleton." He said, "Yes." She said, "The Hargrove family does not know I exist." He said, "No. They believe they are dealing with unclaimed land and a dissolved estate." She said, "But Alistair Hargrove tried to break into this cottage in August. He said he tried to determine what was here. He did not succeed." She said, "He will find out I am here." Pendleton looked in the window. Outside, it was deep night, well past midnight. The road to town was 4 miles of empty dark. He said, "There is the man, Nathaniel Stanwyck. He keeps horses for the Hargrove operation, and he talks. He was in the station area this evening when you arrived. I noticed him when we passed." Beatrice looked at him. Pendleton said, "In a town of 200 people, Mrs. Fenwick, this morning's news is tonight's conversation and tomorrow's letter." Beatrice looked back at the documents on the table. The birth certificate, the trust statement, the letter from Cordelia, the deed to 42 acres. She had less than 10 weeks before a judge in the county seat declared this land abandoned and available for purchase. She had no identification papers. She had no legal standing that could be established without documentation. She had a birth certificate naming a powerful local family, a trust account at a bank in Albany, and a law firm that had apparently been waiting for her for 20 years. She had Pendleton, who had kept a sealed-on envelope for 35 years, on the word of a woman who attended his back pew. She had Harriet Ashby, 88 years old, who had worn a key around her neck for 35 years, and who had been present the night Beatrice came into the world. And she had something else, something she was only beginning to understand the full dimensions of, standing in her mother's kitchen at 1 in the morning with a bandaged palm and 5 cents in her pocket. Cordelia Taft had looked at this exact situation from 35 years away and had built the only structure that could survive it. And she had built it for Beatrice, specifically in a lock only Beatrice could open, on the assumption that Beatrice would come when she had no other door. Beatrice folded the trust statement. She folded the birth certificate. She set Cordelia's letter on top. She said, "I need to be in Albany before Nathaniel Stanwyck sends word to Alistair Hargrove." Pendleton said, "Harriet has a wagon and a horse." She said, "First light." He said, "I will write the introduction to Prescott Stratton tonight." Beatrice looked at him. He was pulling on his coat with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a man who had already decided that this was where he was spending his evening and probably his night. She said, "You do not know me." He said, "No, but I knew Cordelia. And Cordelia told me 35 years ago that her daughter would come when she had no other door. She did not tell me and what to do when that happened. She trusted me to figure that out." He put on his hat. "I am trying to be the kind of man she thought I was." He went to the door, then he turned back. He said, "There is one more thing you should know before tomorrow. In the bottom of the personal box wrapped in oilskins separately from everything else. Cordelia wanted me to tell whoever came that it was there so they would not miss it." Beatrice looked at him. He said, "I do not know what it is." She did not tell me. She only said, "Make sure she finds the last one." He went out. The door closed behind him. Beatrice stood alone in her mother's kitchen, surrounded by 34 years of careful preparation, with the lantern burning low on the table, and the documents spread before her, and the sound of the creak coming through the walls of the stone cottage that Cordelia had kept sealed and waiting for exactly this night. She looked at the personal box. She reached in, under the birth certificate, under the folded letters wrapped in its own piece of oilskin, sealed with wax that had gone brittle with age. There was one more document she had not yet seen. She broke the wax. She opened the oilskin, and she stopped breathing for a moment because what was inside was not from Cordelia. It was a letter in a different hand, entirely in ink, that was darker and more deliberate than her mother's. And the date at the top was April 12th, 1857. 6 years after Cordelia had died, and the signature at the bottom was Horatio Hargrove. And the salutation at the top read, "For my daughter Beatrice Taft Fenwick, to be given to her when she comes to claim what is hers." Beatrice read Horatio Hargrove's letter, standing up the way she had read the hardest parts of Cordelia's letter, because some things require you to be on your feet. The handwriting was different from her mother's, where Cordelia wrote with the careful precision of a woman who had taught herself. Horatio wrote with the loose confidence of a man who had been educated by others and had never needed to think about the act of writing itself. The letters were large and the lines wandered slightly downward across the page as if the weight of what he was saying pulled them. He had written it in April of 1857, 8 years after Cordelia died, 14 years before he died himself. He had written it knowing it might sit unopened for decades. "Beatrice," the letter began, "I do not use the word daughter easily. I have not earned the right to it, but I use it here because it is the accurate word and because accuracy is the only courtesy I can still offer you." She read the next part slowly. He wrote, "I have known you existed every day of your life. Cordelia told me when you were born. She wrote to me once briefly to say that you had arrived safely and that you had her eyes and that she did not need anything from me except that I honor the arrangement we made. I honored it. I paid into the trust every month from 1811 until the year I write this, and I have arranged for the payments to continue after my death through Stratton's office. The land deeds are filed correctly. The taxes will be paid. Cordelia built the container. I supplied what went into it. That is the sum of what I have done for you, and I know it is not enough." Beatrice stopped at the next sentence and read it twice. He wrote, "I have watched from a distance in the way that cowards watch. I knew when you married. I knew when your children were born. I knew when you moved to Philadelphia. I did not intervene because Cordelia made it clear that intervention was not what she wanted from me, and because I told myself that her judgment was better than mine. That was true. It was also convenient for me, and I have not always been able to separate those two things cleanly. She turned to the second page. He wrote, "The Stratton firm has instructions. Prescott Stratton, who will be running the office by the time you read this, knows everything. His father set up the original arrangement and passed it to him intact. They will help you. The documents in the cellar are complete and legally sound." Cordelia was meticulous about that. She understood that sentiment without documentation is just a feeling, and feelings do not hold up in county court. And then near the bottom of the second page, the sentence that Beatrice read 4 times before she put the letter down. "I want you to know that I was not an entirely good man, but I was not a man who forgot what he owed." I hope that distinction means something to you. I suspect it means less than I would like it to. Horatio Hargrove, April 12th, 1857. No apology, no request for forgiveness. Just the plain statement of a man who had arrived at an honest accounting of himself, too late to do much about it, but had done what he could within the time he had. Beatrice folded the letter back into the oilskin. She set it on top of the others. She stood alone in Cordelia's kitchen with the lantern burning low and listened to the creak through the stone walls. Then she went and found the blankets in the cedar chest, made herself a bed on the old couch, and slept. She did not dream. Harriet was at the door before first light with a lantern of her own and a canvas bag of food for the road. She had already hitched the wagon. She did not ask how Beatrice had slept or what she had found in the cellar. She looked at the documents stacked on the kitchen table, then looked at Beatrice's face and said, "Stratton's office opens at 8. Pendleton arrived 10 minutes later with a sealed letter of introduction written in his careful pastoral hand. He gave it to Beatrice without ceremony and then stood on the porch while she loaded the documents into the trunk. He did not offer to come. He seemed to understand that what came next was not his part of the work. As Harriet turned the wagon onto the east road, Beatrice looked back once at the cottage. The shutters were open now, the ones she had opened that morning before dawn, and in the gray pre-dawn light, the windows looked awake. Cordelia had sealed it for 34 years. Beatrice had been inside for less than 12 hours, and already it felt like a house with someone living in it. The road to Albany was 30 miles and took most of the day. Harriet drove without filling the silence with unnecessary words, which was exactly what Beatrice needed from a companion on that particular journey. They stopped once to water the horse at a creek crossing. Beatrice ate the bread Harriet had packed and watched the hills move past and thought about the documents in the trunk at her feet. She was not afraid exactly. She was something more specific than afraid, the focused attention of a person who has identified the exact dimensions of a problem and is running through the available responses. She had the documents. She had the trust. She had the land deeds. She had a law firm that had been waiting for her for 2 decades. What she did not have was time. The Hargrove petition hearing was January 15th. It was now the first week of November. Prescott Stratton's office was on State Street in Albany, a narrow brick building between a dry goods importer and an insurance firm. The sign above the door read Stratton and Sons Attorneys at Law, established 1809. Beatrice walked in carrying her trunk and Pendleton's letter and the organized contents of Cordelia's cellar, and the young clerk at the front desk looked at her slippers with barely concealed confusion and then went to get Mr. Stratton. Prescott Stratton was 52 gray at the temples with the measured movements of a man who had spent his career handling other people's complicated situations and had learned to move through them without adding his own agitation to theirs. He came out of his office, looked at Beatrice, looked at the trunk, and then looked at her face with the particular focus of someone recognizing something he had been expecting. He said, "Mrs. Fenwick." She had not told the clerk her name. She had only said she was there about the Taft estate. She said, "How did you know?" He said, "Because you look exactly like the description my father left me, and because no one else was ever going to walk through that door." He took her into his office and closed the door, and she put the documents on his desk one by one, and he looked at each one without rushing. He looked at the land deeds. He looked at the trust statements. He looked at the birth certificate and held it at an angle to the window for a long moment. He looked at Cordelia's letter and Horatio's letter, both setting them side by side on the blotter. Then he opened his own filing cabinet and took out a folder that was thick with age, the cover soft with handling labeled in older handwriting, Taft C. Active. He said, "My father maintained this file for 40 years. I have maintained it for 20. He told me before he died that someone would come for it, and that when they came, I was to do whatever was required." He said, "Prescott, this file is the most important work this office has ever done, and it will not be finished until you finish it." He set the folder on the desk and opened it. Inside, among the documents Beatrice expected to find, there was one she did not. It was a codicil to the original 1810 contract between Cordelia and Horatio, drafted in 1847, 2 years before Cordelia died, and notarized by Stratton's father at a meeting that the elder Stratton had recorded in his personal notes as CT came alone. Clear mind, specific instructions. She knows exactly what she is doing. Beatrice read the codicil. It said, "In the event that any member of the Hargrove family initiates legal proceedings to contest, delay, or otherwise obstruct the transfer of the described properties and trust assets to Beatrice Taft or her heirs, all described assets shall immediately and irrevocably transfer to the First Baptist Church of Grayfield, New York, to be held in perpetuity for the maintenance of the churchyard in the grave of Cordelia Taft." Beatrice read it once. Then she looked at Stratton. He said, "My father called it the Iron Clause." Horatio agreed to it. It is in his hand at the bottom of the page, his signature and his seal. She said he signed a document that would take everything away from his own family if they challenged it. Stratton said he did. My father asked him why. Horatio said, "Because if they challenge it, they deserve to lose it." Beatrice sat with that for a moment. She said Alistair Hargrove filed the petition in August. Stratton said, "I know. I have been monitoring the county filings. His petition was filed on the grounds of abandoned estate, unknown heirs, tax burden to the county. It is a legitimate legal argument in the absence of a documented heir." He paused, in the absence being the key phrase. She said, "How long to establish my claim?" He said, "With what you have brought me today, I can file a counter petition within the week. Authentication of the birth certificate will take time. The trust documentation is straightforward. The land deeds are already on file at the county clerk." He looked at her over the documents. "What I need to know is whether you are prepared for what comes after." She said, "What comes after?" He said, "Alistair Hargrove is not going to withdraw quietly. He has resources and lawyers who are better paid than I am. They will challenge the birth certificate. They will challenge Cordelia's competency when she drew up the codicil. They may challenge your identity directly." He set his hands flat on the desk. "They will make it uncomfortable. I want you to know that before we begin." Beatrice looked at him for a moment. She said, "Mr. Stratton, I was put out of my son's house 10 days ago with $2 in my pocket. I walked 11 blocks to a train station in cloth slippers. I rode in a third-class car for 6 hours with no food. I walked 4 miles on a gravel road at midnight and pried boards off a door with a borrowed iron bar." She put her hands on the edge of his desk. "I am not going to be stopped by uncomfortable." Stratton looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "No, I do not suppose you are." He pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward him and picked up his pen. He said, "Let us begin." Alistair Hargrove came to Albany 12 days later. Beatrice had known he would come. Stratton had warned her. The counter petition had been filed, the documentation submitted, and the county clerk's office had recorded the existence of a living heir to the Taft estate, which meant the information was available to anyone who walked in and asked to see the pending filings. Alistair Hargrove walked in and asked. He arrived at Stratton's office on a Thursday morning with 2 lawyers from a firm in New York City, men who wore better suits than anyone in Albany and who carried themselves with the specific confidence of attorneys who have not lost many cases. They requested a meeting. Stratton told Beatrice. Beatrice said, "Let them in." Alistair Hargrove was 55 years old. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with hair that had gone entirely silver and eyes that were gray and clear. He came into the office ahead of his lawyers and stopped when he saw Beatrice sitting in the chair across from Stratton's desk. He looked at her eyes. She had been told her whole life that she had her mother's eyes. She did not know what Horatio Hargrove's eyes had looked like until this moment. They were looking back at her from Alistair Hargrove's face, the same gray, the same directness. The recognition was involuntary. She could see that the brief, unguarded moment before a man of his discipline reassembled his expression. He sat down. His lawyers positioned themselves to either side. He said, I want you to understand that I did not know you existed. Beatrice said, I know. He said, my father never mentioned you, not once in my entire life. Beatrice said, your father knew about me every day of my life. He paid into a trust fund for decades. He signed documents acknowledging my existence. He wrote me a letter in 1857 that has been sitting in a cellar in Grayfield waiting for me to find it. He knew. He chose not to tell you. Alistair Hargrove was quiet for a moment. She could see him processing the reordering required when a fact this size enters a life that was built around its absence. He said, what do you want from this? Beatrice said, what is mine? He said the land has been in the county tax rolls as effectively unclaimed for 34 years. Beatrice said, because my mother sealed the property and paid the taxes from a trust account your father funded. The taxes have not been delinquent a single year. The land has not been unclaimed. It has been held in trust for a documented heir. I am the documented heir. One of the New York lawyers leaned forward and began to speak. Alistair Hargrove raised one hand without looking at him, and the lawyer stopped. Hargrove said, you understand that my family has interests in this county that go back 3 generations. Beatrice said, I understand that your family has interests. I am also a member of your family by your father's own documented acknowledgement. Those 2 facts do not cancel each other out. He looked at her for a long time. She did not look away. He said, I need time to consider this. Beatrice said, the hearing is January 15th. You have until then. He stood up. His lawyer stood with him. At the door, he turned back. He said, my father was a man who believed that obligation could substitute for presence. He paid what he owed, but he was never there. He set up structures to manage things he did not want to face directly. He was not a bad man. He was an absent one. Beatrice said, I know. He said, I spent my whole life trying to understand the distance in him. Why he sometimes looked at the horizon when we were talking. Why he kept that office locked. Why there were accounts I was never shown. He put his hand on the doorframe. He said, I suppose now I know. He left. His lawyers followed. Stratton sat very still for a moment after they left. Then he said, that went differently than I expected. Beatrice said, he is not his father. He just thought he was. The legal proceedings that followed were not simple. Alistair Hargrove did not withdraw his petition. His New York lawyers filed challenges to the birth certificate, arguing that the document could not be authenticated without a living witness to the birth. They filed a motion questioning Cordelia's mental competency when she drew up the 1847 codicil, citing the fact that no independent witness had been present at the signing beyond the elder Stratton, who was himself now dead. They did not attempt to have Beatrice declared incompetent. She had the sense that Alistair Hargrove had specifically instructed them not to pursue that approach. Whatever else he was not willing to put his name to that particular argument. The hearing before Judge Orrin Whitfield of the Albany County Court was held on January 14th, one day before the original deadline. Harriet Ashby came to Albany by train. She was 88 years old and she made the journey alone, which impressed even the bailiff who helped her to her seat. She sat in the gallery with her back straight and her hands in her lap, and when the Hargrove attorneys argued that there was no living witness who could confirm Beatrice's birth in Grayfield. In 1811, Harriet stood up from her seat in the gallery without being asked before Stratton could call her to the stand and said in a voice that carried to every corner of the room, I was there. I'm a living witness. I delivered that child on the 14th of October, 1811, in the stone cottage on the East Road outside Grayfield. I was 26 years old. Cordelia Taft named her Beatrice and turned her toward the window so she could see where she had arrived. I am 88 years old, and my memory of that night is clearer than most things that happened last week. Do you want to proceed with this line of argument, counsel, or shall we save everyone the time? The room was very quiet. The Hargrove attorney said, the court should note that this witness appeared without being called, and her testimony cannot be considered. Judge Whitfield said, the court will note that this witness appeared of her own volition, which is generally a sign that someone has something true to say. He looked at Stratton. Counsel will call this witness formally at the appropriate time. Stratton called her formally. Harriet said everything she had said and more. She described the room, the light, the season, the precise sequence of events on that October night in 1811. She described Cordelia's composure during the birth and afterward. The Hargrove attorneys cross-examined her for 40 minutes. Harriet answered every question with the same direct, unhurried steadiness of a woman who has carried a fact in trust for 72 years and does not find it difficult to say plainly, When one attorney suggested her memory at 88 could not be trusted, she looked at him and said, "I remember the smell of the fire that night, the color of the blanket Cordelia had ready, and the exact words she said when she first held that child. I have had 72 years to forget, and I have not forgotten a word of it. You may draw your own conclusions, counsel." Pendleton testified by written affidavit, which Stratton read into the record. The affidavit described Cordelia coming to him in 1848, her words about sending something ahead, his 35 years of keeping the sealed envelope, and his own observation of the seller documents, the work of a person who intended them to be found and used. Stratton introduced Horatio Hargrove's 1857 letter. He introduced the 1810 contract. He introduced the 1847 codicil with Horatio's signature and seal at the bottom. The Hargrove lawyers argued that the signature on the codicil could not be verified without a living witness to the signing. Stratton produced his father's personal case notes from the 1847 meeting, handwritten dated describing Horatio Hargrove's presence, the conditions of the signing, and a specific notation in the margin that read, read the iron clause 3 times before signing. He understands it fully. He signed it anyway. That is the kind of man he is trying to become. The elder Stratton had written that in 1847. His son read it aloud in an Albany courtroom in January of 1884. The room was quiet again in the way that rooms go quiet when something true has been said plainly enough that no argument can reach it. Judge Whitfield took 2 hours to deliberate. His ruling was thorough and unambiguous. The birth certificate was authenticated on the combined strength of Harriet's eyewitness testimony, the 1810 contract naming Beatrice as the intended beneficiary of the trust, and the 1857 letter in which Horatio Hargrove himself used the word daughter without qualification. The land deeds were confirmed as valid. The trust assets were confirmed as belonging to Beatrice Fenwick as the sole documented heir of Cordelia Taft. The 1847 codicil was confirmed as binding. The Hargrove petition was dismissed. Alistair Hargrove was not in the courtroom when the ruling was read. His lawyers were. They sat without expression and wrote things in their notebooks, and when it was over, they gathered their papers and left without speaking to anyone. Beatrice sat in her chair at the plaintiff's table and did not move for a moment. Stratton said, "It is done." She said, "Yes." Harriet came through the gate from the gallery and sat in the chair beside Beatrice and put her hand over Beatrice's hand on the table and did not say anything because there was nothing that needed saying. Beatrice looked at the window. The January light was thin and white through the tall courtroom windows. She thought about Cordelia working by lamplight in the years before she sealed the cottage, organizing each box, labeling each document in her careful block letters, knowing she would not live to see the day those boxes were open. She thought about the precision of it, the patience of it, the complete absence of sentimentality in the way it had been executed. This was not the work of a woman acting on emotion. This was the work of an engineer. She thought about Horatio Hargrove writing a letter in 1857 to a daughter he had never met and would never meet, trying to say something honest in the space between what he owed and what he had been. She thought about Prescott Stratton's father writing in the margin of his case notes, "That is the kind of man he is trying to become." All of it built in silence, all of it waiting, none of it dependent on any single person still being alive to hold it together. 3 weeks later, Alistair Hargrove sent a letter to Stratton's office. It was addressed to Beatrice directly. It was short. He wrote, "I have spent considerable time since the hearing going through my father's locked office, which I had not entered since his death. I found his correspondence with Cordelia Taft from 1811 to 1849. I found the receipts for trust payments. I found a photograph of you taken sometime in the 1860s, which my father had kept in the back of his desk drawer. I do not know what you want from me, and I am not sure I have anything to offer that would be of value to you. But I thought you should know that I looked. Horatio Hargrove's son." Beatrice read the letter once. Then she wrote back. She wrote, "You do not owe me anything. Your father made his arrangements and they held. That is more than most people manage. I have what I came for. I hope you have found something useful in that office. Beatrice Fenwick." She sealed it and gave it to Stratton to post. 6 months later, the county clerk received notice that the Hargrove family had withdrawn all remaining paperwork related to the Taft property and had recorded a formal acknowledgement of Beatrice Fenwick's title to the described lands. It was a bureaucratic document, dry and precise, but it meant that Alistair Hargrove had decided the acknowledgement was something he could put his name to. Beatrice moved back into the Greyfield cottage before spring. The repairs took 3 months. A local mason repointed the stone foundation. A carpenter from the next town replaced the rotted porch boards. A well man came and tested the water and said it was as clean as any he had tested in 20 years. She had electricity run in from the road the first time the cottage had ever had it. The afternoon the line was connected, and she turned on the single bulb in the kitchen and the room filled with steady electric light. She stood in the middle of the floor and looked at it for a long time, thinking about Cordelia reading by lamplight at this same table for 30 years and what it would have meant to her to see this room lit up like this. The distance between their lives measured not in years but in light. The tin cup stayed on the windowsill. The jars of preserves stayed on the shelf. Cordelia's chair stayed beside the fireplace. She leased 20 acres to a farmer named Jasper Cromwell, who grew hay and kept a small beef herd. She gave 5 acres to Pendleton's church. Pendleton used it for a community garden the following spring. The remaining land she kept. The forest to the west, the creek frontage on the east. She walked those acres in spring and knew every corner of them within a month. Harriet came for dinner twice a week. They had a simple arrangement. Harriet brought apple cider and Beatrice made whatever was growing in the kitchen garden. They sat on the porch in good weather and beside the fire in bad, and they talked in the comfortable way of two women who have passed the age when conversation requires a destination. Pendleton came on Sundays after his service. They drank coffee at the kitchen table and argued about things that did not require resolution, and then he went home. Beatrice wrote to Rosalind in Philadelphia regularly. The letters were not about the court case or the trust. They were about the morning light on the creek, red-tailed hawks that returned to the same thermal above the west field every afternoon, the garden, the particular sound the stone walls made at night when the temperature dropped. Rosalind wrote back. Her letters were shorter, full of the particular energy of a 17-year-old discovering that the world extended in directions she had not previously considered. She asked questions about Cordelia. She asked what it had been like to walk into that cottage for the first time. Beatrice wrote, "It was like reading the last page of a book I did not know I had been living inside. Everything before it was still true, but the ending changed what the earlier parts meant." Rosalind came to Greyfield in April on a Friday by train, having told her parents she was visiting a school friend in Schenectady. She walked 4 miles from the station and arrived at the cottage gate with her dress muddy to the knees and her chin set in that particular way that means a person has decided. Beatrice opened the door. They looked at each other across the threshold. Rosalind said, "I am sorry about what happened. I was in the house that morning. I heard everything. I did not do anything." Beatrice looked at her granddaughter, 17 years old, her mother's nose in Elias's jaw, and something else underneath both of those that Beatrice recognized the particular expression of a person who is in the process of deciding what kind of person to be. Beatrice said, "Come in." She made lunch from the garden, bread she had baked that morning, tomatoes and beans, cucumber and vinegar. She put the tin cup on the table and poured water from the well. Then she told Rosalind about Cordelia, all of it, the letter on the mantel, the cellar, the birth certificate, the iron claws, the courtroom. Harriet standing up from the gallery before she was called 88 years old and louder than the lawyers. She told her about Horatio's letter and what it had said and what it had not said. She told her about Alistair Hargrove looking at her eyes and recognizing something he had not expected to find. Rosalind listened to all of it without interrupting once. When Beatrice finished, Rosalind sat for a while in the quiet of the kitchen. Then she said she never got to know it worked. Beatrice said no. Rosalind said she did all of that, and she never found out if you would come. Beatrice said, "She knew I would come. That is different from getting to see it." Rosalind looked at the tin cup on the table between them, the same cup that had been in this window since before Beatrice was born. She said, "Do you think she knew what your life would be like, that you would end up needing this so badly?" Beatrice thought about that question seriously the way it deserved. She said, "I think she knew that the world is hard on women who do not have a door of their own. And I think she decided that I was going to have one, whatever it cost her to build it." They were quiet for a moment. Rosalind said, "What do I do about father? About what happened?" Beatrice looked at her granddaughter across the table. She said, "You go home. You live your life. You do not spend it carrying guilt about a morning when you were young and frightened and did not know how to act. But you remember it, because the day will come when someone near you needs someone to step forward and you will remember that morning in the hallway, and you will know which choice you are making. Rosalind looked at her. Beatrice said, "That is not forgiveness. That is something more useful than forgiveness. That is instruction." Rosalind, he left on Sunday afternoon with the particular gait of a person who has been given something they are still figuring out how to carry. She turned at the gate and looked back once. Beatrice raised her hand. Rosalind raised hers. Then she turned and kept walking, and Beatrice watched her go until she was around the bend in the road and out of sight. 3 months after that, Beatrice wrote one letter to Elias. She had thought about it for a long time. She had decided finally not on the basis of forgiveness or reconciliation, but on the simpler basis that she was his mother and he was her son, and she wanted him to know she was alive and where she was. The letter said, "Elias, I am living in my mother's cottage in Grayfield, New York. I have found what she left for me. I am well in better health than I have been in years, and I have more than I need. I do not require anything from you. I am not writing to ask for anything or to give you anything except the information that I exist and am not suffering. You can do with that what you like, your mother." She did not invite him to visit. She did not close the door against it either. She simply left it where it was. Elias did not write back. Beatrice had not expected him to. Celestine read the small notice in the Philadelphia Inquirer about the Taft estate judgment. She set the paper down in the kitchen and sat with it for a long time. She did not show it to Elias. She folded it to that page and placed it at the back of her writing desk, where she kept things that required thought she was not yet ready to finish. Beatrice Fenwick was 73 years old in the summer of 1884, sitting on the porch of her mother's cottage while the light went down behind the western hills. She owned 42 acres of good upstate land. She had $400,000 in a trust account in Albany. She had a garden behind the house and a creek on the eastern boundary and red-tailed hawks that came back to the same thermal above the Westfield every afternoon, as reliable as anything she had ever counted on in her life. She had a granddaughter who wrote letters with good questions. She had a neighbor who brought cider. She had a reverend who argued about newspapers and then went home. She had a lawyer in Albany who had kept a file marked active for 20 years on behalf of a woman he had never met. She had a tin cup on the windowsill that Cordelia had put there so long ago that the windowsill itself had shaped slightly around it. Some evenings she picked it up and turned it in her hands and set it back down. Not always thinking about Cordelia when she did it, sometimes just holding it, the weight of it, the plain factual solidity of a thing that had been in the same spot for longer than most people she knew had been alive. Cordelia Taft had never seen the inside of the Albany courthouse. She had never known whether the iron claws would hold, whether Beatrice would come, whether any of it would mean anything at all. She had built a structure in the years she had and trusted it to stand after she was gone. It had stood, every piece of it. Beatrice set the tin cup down on the windowsill where it belonged and looked out at the light leaving the hills. She thought about what it takes to build something for a person you will never see grow into who they become. The discipline of it. The faith that does not require evidence, because by the time the evidence arrives, you will not be there to receive it. Cordelia had given every piece of what she had organized it into a structure that could not be dismantled, locked it with a combination only Beatrice could know, and walked away from it into the cold of a February that took her 3 days later. She had done all of that without knowing if it would matter. It had mattered. Beatrice was not a woman who had been saved by the past. She was a woman who had been built by it in the way that all of us are shaped by the things done on our behalf in rooms we were not yet in the careful work of people who loved us before we knew we needed to be loved that way. She was the door Cordelia had built, and she was open.